Well, I do hope that you are enjoying your Christmas season. We're getting down to the wire, by the way. So it's really touch and go here. If you have not finished your shopping at this point, I feel so sorry for you, because you may be faced with doing the unimaginable, the unthinkable. You might have to go to an actual store. I mean, it is too late. Like, you have to overnight some stuff. This is when you start finding those presents that nobody wants, but it'll get here tomorrow, so that's what they get. It's like, well, I didn't really know I needed that, but there you go. It's 24 hours. It showed up on time. But some of you might actually have to go to a store, which it seems kind of unbelievable these days to me. I mean, I never walk in stores. My kids have no idea what it is to walk into an actual store. We have our kids pick out little things to give to each other, and they don't go to a store. They go on Amazon, and they look at each other's lists and say, I'm going to give him this, he wants that, And my kids have virtually no concept of walking through a store. But I remember what it was like. I remember what it was like when I was little, and my mom would take me Christmas shopping. That was a joy. You remember when you're a little kid and you're getting drug around from store to store? And I remember department stores. And when you're little, department stores, they're overwhelming to me now, but they were so overwhelming. These are like giant mazes that you can get lost in. It's so hard to not lose your children in those, I would imagine, because I don't take my kids. I think I've made that clear. But I remember being really little, and there's these just giant racks of clothing, and you can't see over them. You're like 2 feet tall. You can't see over them. You can kind of try to see between them, but there's all the crowd and mash of people. And so I'm kind of looking under the clothes, right? That's the only way to navigate that. I remember one time when I was probably 5, 6 years old, and I lost my mom in one of those department stores. And I'm sure she knew right where I was, because parents never lose their children. I can't even say that with a straight face. Oh, we lose them all the time. Anyway, I lost my mom at this point, and I'm wondering where she is. I wasn't freaked out, but I'm looking around, and again, I can't look over the clothes. I'm looking under the clothes, and I see her legs. Because when you're 2 feet tall, that's how you identify your parents, right? You rarely look up. You're just where's the legs? And so there's my mom's legs. She's wearing brown pants, and I make a beeline right through all the clothes over and go to her leg and grab her leg, and then I hear a voice that I do not recognize. Say, I am not your mom. And I looked again and was like, no, you're not. And it was startling. I was so convinced. This person had the same legs as my mom. She's wearing the same pants as my mom. I was so convinced. And I looked again. It's like, nope, not my mom. Very uncomfortable, right? And then I'm looking around, where is my mom? Have you ever had a moment in life where you realize that somebody you thought you knew, you didn't really know them? Maybe it was somebody you really trusted. Maybe somebody you looked up to. Maybe somebody you depended upon. Maybe a mentor, a role model, even a hero to you. And at some point you looked back at your history together and you realized you had read it all wrong. They were not who you thought they were. And sometimes when we make those discoveries about other people, sometimes it's all good, right? It's just kind of funny stuff. I'm not the quickest guy in the world. And so Carrie and I had been married for multiple years before I realized that she's actually an extrovert. I thought she was an introvert because she's quiet and she doesn't like to be the center of attention. And so I was convinced, this is definitely an introvert. And then I discovered, lo and behold, she is energized by being around other people. I'm actually the introvert. People are like, what are you doing on stage talking to all these people? That's because I basically get up here and have a conversation with myself. And so it's actually very comfortable for me because you're not talking back. I don't have to engage you at an emotional level because that would stress me out and suck all of my energy. But Carrie thrives being around other people. So sometimes you discover things about other people and it's just fun. It's interesting. It's things you didn't know about them that make them, more interesting to know. Stupid human tricks, or maybe a hidden gift or a talent. But sometimes it's devastating. Sometimes it makes you rethink everything you thought you understood about them and your whole relationship with them. And this is true of almost anything in life. It doesn't just have to be people. This could be a job that you got. That you thought, this is the job, I can't wait to do this job. You do it for a little while and realize this isn't the job that you thought it was. Maybe you move to a new place. And you go, I can't wait to move here. And you get there and you start to do life there and realize this place isn't really everything that I thought it was going to be. There's all sorts of things and experiences that we have in life that at some point we can reevaluate. We can look again and be like, that's not what I thought it was. It's not what I hoped it would be. But people can hurt the most. As we've been leading up to Christmas, we've been spending time just looking at the book of Isaiah and looking at his prophecies of the Messiah that are some hundreds of years before the birth of Jesus. And it's so interesting because when you read the historical accounts of the kings and the chronicles in the Old Testament scriptures, they give lists of kings who came and went throughout this hundreds of years period. And when you read these lists, what you find is that there is a pattern, and it's not a good one. It's a pattern of failed king after failed king, terrible king after terrible king after terrible king after terrible king, and then some that seem better for a time, but there's kind of always a but at the end of it. It's like, this was a great king except for this. There was always something that ended in failure for pretty much every king that you saw as you read through this list. And so you can imagine for those living in the nation of Israel and the nation of Judah, as you're seeing all of these kings come and go, all the ongoing disappointment and disillusionment. You're just waiting for one king that's finally going to be a good king and won't end in failure. Will finally lead to the restoration of your nation to the glory that it was under David and Solomon, to be restored to all that you hoped and dreamed your nation and your people could be. But instead, they're faced over and over and again with the reality that none of those kings were who they hoped they would be. But in Isaiah 9, God speaking through Isaiah, he tells of a new king, a child who would be born. And this king, this child would be unlike any king who came before. That this was a king who would finally defeat their enemies and restore the nation, that was going to be everything that the people had hoped and had trusted God for. And you can imagine for those people living at that time, after all the disappointment that they had been through, that they're finally hearing what they've always wanted to hear from God, that God was going to move. He was going to give this king. He was going to give this child. Like, this is the greatest news that they could have possibly received. And really, at the time that Isaiah is writing, is especially good news because they were living under a terrible king. King Ahaz was a tyrant. He was cruel. Under him, the nation was rife with corruption and violence and injustice. And not only that, but the nation at that time was living under the shadow of the Assyrian Empire. And these were the big bad bully of the ancient Near East. I mean, this was a nation that came in and wiped everybody out, and they just took over. And so they were living under the threat of Assyria while their own country was just in utter turmoil. And so you can imagine for them hearing, oh, but there's this new king coming, like what that would mean to them. If only it were true, if only it were true. Because what they were living through was beyond anything that any of us in this room can really imagine. What they were experiencing in their day-to-day lives, what they were experiencing within society is beyond anything that we can fully appreciate. I mean, listen to how Isaiah describes this. Leading into chapter 9, in chapter 8, he closes with this: distressed and hungry. Talking about the people living at that time. They will roam through the land. When they are famished, they will become enraged, and looking upward will curse their king and their God. Isn't that an interesting connection? They curse their king because God is the one who establishes the kings. And then they curse God because he's the one who did it. So you have the kings who are bad kings, but they curse God as well. Like, how could you give us this kind of a king? Yet another failed king, another disappointment. King after king after king, and they will curse their king and their God. And then they will look toward the earth and see only distress and darkness and fearful gloom, and they will be thrust into utter darkness. That sounds pretty bad, doesn't it? That's pretty bad. Only distress, darkness, fearful gloom, thrust into utter darkness. But then Isaiah stops. He pauses everything at that point to say, all is not lost. Light is coming. Chapter 9, nevertheless, there will be no more gloom for those who are in distress. In the past, God humbled the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali, but in the future he will honor Galilee of the Gentiles by the way of the sea along the Jordan. He's talking about northern regions of the northern kingdom of Israel. So this is a land that had already been overrun, already been conquered by Assyria some years before. And so Isaiah's message is that while the northern kingdom had been plundered before, in the future God was going to restore them. Salvation is coming. The people walking in darkness have seen a great light. On those living in the land of the shadow of death, a light has dawned. You have enlarged the nation and increased their joy. They rejoice before you as people rejoice at the harvest, as men rejoice when dividing the plunder. For as in the day of Midian's defeat, this is a reference back to Gideon, back in the book of Judges, where God miraculously conquers the Midianites. So this is a time of God's conquest for the sake of his people. He says, for as in the day of Midian's defeat, just like then, you have shattered the yoke that burdens them, the bar across their shoulders, the rod of their oppressor. Every warrior's boot used in battle and every garment rolled in blood will be destined for burning, will be fuel for the fire. Isaiah is using triumphant battle language here. This is God's conquering army, victorious over a vanquished enemy. And what Isaiah is envisioning is that God is going to overthrow the Assyrians, the one who is threatening Judah after already taking over Israel. And he's saying, look, at some point, God is going to come in and he's going to overthrow them. He's going to reunite the nation. And so Isaiah is saying, look, I know that Assyria looks scary now. I know they look daunting, they look terrifying, but you don't need to be afraid because God is going to shatter their yoke. The burden they're going to place upon you, everything that they're going to do, God is going to take care of all of that. And he gives this vivid picture at the end that the Assyrians' warriors' clothes that were used to create war, that were used to fight against his people, that this clothing is stripped from their dead bodies and it's used to fuel their fires. This is graphic imagery of total victory over one's enemies. And it all begins with the birth of a child. Verse 6, for to us a child is born, to us a son is given. In the Hebrew, the timeline here isn't all that clear. Isaiah could be talking about a recent birth, an imminent birth, a future birth. It's hard to tell, but what's clear is that this son, this child is a gift from God. To us, a son is given. It is God who gives the gift. And the child isn't a gift just to his parents, but the child is a gift to all the people. And the government will be on his shoulders, and he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. I don't know what kind of titles you've been given in your life, but I'm guessing they weren't like this. You know, you rarely have titles like this in our world today. Maybe you got Employee of the Month one time. That's great, good for you. One I saw recently, I thought this was great. I was driving behind this lady and she had a bumper sticker that said, world's okayest mom. That's living up to something right there. Like, I love that. See, there's titles that we might use, that we might earn along the way, but these titles, oh, these are impressive. Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. This is, in Isaiah's world, this is royal language, kingly language. See, the ancient Near East, it was typical for new kings to receive 4 royal titles, 4 royal names. And these names were often theophoric. These were titles that were normally reserved for gods, but in this case, they were attributed to this new king. Now, the reason for this, for some nations, was because they actually believed that their kings were divine. And so it made sense. They would give them divine titles because they believed that their kings were divine. But in Jewish culture, of course, that would never fly. You don't worship your king. The king is not God. The king is an emissary of God. You only worship God. And so in this case, these titles were to communicate that the king was working and acting and reigning on behalf of God. That God is reigning through this king with all of his wisdom, all of his power, all of his authority, all of it through this king for the sake of his nation. And so what Isaiah is picturing here is someone through whom God is channeling all of his power. God is channeling all of his authority. God is channeling all of his wisdom for the sake of his people. And so let's look at these titles. Wonderful Counselor, right? He's the one, this king is the one who leads the nation with God's divine wisdom. Mighty God, he is the one who defends the nation and defeats all of her enemies with God's power and authority. Everlasting Father. In those days, the king's reigns were often described with this hyperbolic language of, oh, your king, your rule will last forever, God. It will be everlasting, not God, excuse me, king, everlasting. And it had to do with their understanding of a dynasty, to establish a dynasty of this king through his son, through his son, who's through his son, through his son. And so this isn't literal in the sense of, oh, you, this king, are going to live forever, everlasting forever, but that this would be a dynasty for the ongoing blessing of the nation. Father describes how this king would care for the nation, like a loving and nurturing parent. Prince of Peace, he's the one who will bring peace to the nation by defeating her enemies and protecting her from all other threats through the power and the might of God himself. And so Isaiah is using these titles to say that this king, he's as good, in fact, he's better than anything they've ever imagined. Verse 7, of the increase of his government and peace, there will be no end. He will reign on David's throne and over his kingdom, establishing and upholding it with justice and righteousness from that time on and forever. The zeal of the Lord Almighty will accomplish this. This is something that God will do. When all seems lost, Isaiah says, God is going to raise up a king beyond your wildest dreams. He is going to lead the nation in prosperity. He's going to defeat all of their enemies, drive them from the land. This dynasty will be established that will never end. There will be peace and security for the nation. Justice and righteousness will win out. In other words, you are going to live happily ever after. And that's what God is going to do through the child. Which raises the million-dollar question. Who is this child? Who is this child who's going to accomplish all this? Who's going to do all of this? Now, I know some of you grew up in church. You've been to Sunday school, and so you're so anxious. You're like, I know, it's Jesus. Calm down. We're not there yet. Imagine for a moment that you're one of Isaiah's listeners. You're living in that time. You're living in that place. See, we get very quick to jump onto the Jesus, but hold up for a second, because as Isaiah is talking to these people, they're not thinking about a Messiah. They're looking for a king in the here and now who's going to defeat a very real Assyrian army that is bearing down on them, which points them in their minds. As Isaiah is saying this points to them not to a Messiah 700 years later in Jesus, but actually to a different king, a king named Hezekiah, who was the son of Ahaz. Now, don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying that Isaiah is not prophesying of Jesus. He absolutely is. I absolutely believe that he is. But again, understand that we read this and we quickly go, oh, it's Messiah Jesus. That must be who it is, but put yourself in their shoes. See, when they hear what Isaiah is saying, they're not thinking about a Messiah. They're thinking, but who's going to save us from the Assyrians? Who's going to be here right now? Well, look, King Ahaz, he's a horrible king. He's a tyrant. It can't be him. Maybe it's the next king. Maybe it's his son. Maybe Hezekiah. Maybe Hezekiah is the guy we've been waiting for. Maybe he's the one that God is talking about raising up. In fact, the more I think about it, the more that just makes sense. I mean, he's the next king in line. Surely that's who God is going to raise up. It's going to be Hezekiah. See, it makes a lot of sense. And even more so when you understand that Hezekiah was a great king. Ahaz dies, Hezekiah becomes king, and he's a great king. He rules very, very well. He establishes justice. He does all the right things. He is a very successful, wonderful king for the nation until he isn't. All right? It's kind of like if your team gets the number one pick in the draft and you get a quarterback, and you're like, this guy, pinning all our hopes on him. And you get this quarterback, and all the scouts have said, this guy is generational talent. He's gonna be legendary, right? It's not one Super Bowl, it's a dynasty. You're gonna have all these Super Bowls. You just can't wait. And he comes into camp and everybody's just raving about the arm. He's got a cannon for an arm and he can run so fast. And then they play the first few games and he is a revelation. You're like, my goodness, this guy, we are gonna be the greatest team in the National Football League for years on end. And sure enough, that year, you get to the playoffs and you haven't seen the playoffs in forever. right? And he wins Rookie of the Year in a landslide, and the next year he's MVP, and you get a little further in the playoffs, and you get a little further in the playoffs, and then every year you're like, this is the year, baby, this is the year. And then the next year passes, and you get to the conference championship, and you don't quite win that game. And the next year you lose in the Super Bowl, but the next year his play starts to fade off a little bit, and a little more, and a little more. And pretty soon his jersey isn't selling near as quickly as it used to. In fact, he gets traded and you just use that jersey to clean your car or something. See, Hezekiah, for a time there, his jersey was flying off the shelves. Man, they thought he was the man. He was the guy going to bring all of this to fruition. He was the guy who was going to answer all of their dreams and all of their prayers. And he was a great king for a long time. Under Ahaz, the country had suffered so much. He had closed their temples, the temple. He had instituted child sacrifice and sacrificed some of his own children in the worship of idols. Like under him, the country was rife with corruption and violence and greed. And then Hezekiah comes in and he opens the temple. He reestablishes the law of God in the land. He does all the things right. He leads people to worship God again. He looks so good for so long. And then he blows it. And the scriptures tell us he became arrogant. And in his pride, he set the nation up for disaster. He made decisions that led directly to the fall of Jerusalem and to the final enslavement of God's people. But see, he looked so good for so long. And at some point, you have to wonder if the people who had put so much hope in Hezekiah, if they didn't look back and go, man, he's not who we thought he was. Man, we thought he was going to be so great, but now we're just disappointed and a little more disillusioned. And what's really tragic is it's not just Hezekiah that they would feel disappointed in. Because see, at some point, if you keep getting draft picks and they don't work out, you stop blaming the players and you start blaming the GM. As a Cowboys fan, believe me, I know how this works. See, at some point, some of you are just getting that. At some point, I wonder if they didn't look around and think, you know what, maybe this isn't the king's problem. We keep all these bad kings. Who's putting the kings in place? Maybe this isn't a problem with our kings. Maybe this is a problem with God. That he's not living up to what he says. He's not living up to what he said he would do. God is the one who's failed us. Have you ever been disillusioned with God? Disappointed with God? You ever looked back in your life and thought, this is not how it was supposed to go? God, you were supposed to do something different. You're not all I hoped you would be. I have had more friends than I care to count who at some point in their lives were so on fire for God. They're so passionate about God. They were going to serve God and whatever God led them to in their lives. And then over a series of years and moments of disappointment, they decided that God wasn't who they'd hoped he would be. And they decided that they were better off without him. And I wonder for the people listening to Isaiah, if a few years down the road, as Hezekiah comes to the throne and they thought, this is the man, this is the guy, everything's going to work out, and it didn't go well, that if I wonder at some point they began to become disillusioned with God because God was the one he said was going to raise up this king. God said it was going to happen, and then it didn't happen. The problem isn't with the kings, the problem is with God. In fact, there are scholars who actually look at this exact passage, Isaiah 9, as evidence that God does not fulfill prophecy. There are people who look at this passage as an example of failed prophecy, that God doesn't actually know what he's talking about. It's all just a big charade, and see, God failed. God said it was going to happen. It didn't happen. And I wonder if for those living at that time, if they looked at this and thought, God, I just can't trust you anymore. Like, God, you haven't done what you said you were going to do. The failure isn't with the kings. The failure is with God. This isn't what was supposed to happen. But then something really remarkable changed. something remarkable did happen. Years passed, and Judah was conquered and then conquered again, and the people were exiled and they returned to their homeland, and Jerusalem was destroyed and then rebuilt, and empires rose and fell. And after over 400 years of silence, as the people lived in their disillusionment and their disappointment, God began to whisper, "Look again." Because there was a new child, another child. And this child was unlike any other child who'd ever been born. This is a child who was given by God in a way that no other child has ever been given. Conceived by a virgin, born in a little nowhere town, a little nowhere village, and shepherds and wise men came to see what it was all about, and to worship this child. Can you imagine? And angels sang of this baby that was born. And when he was born, people said the most outrageous things about him, that he was the light of God and the light of life. Can you imagine? And when he grew up, he made outlandish claims about himself. He claimed to be the very Son of God, the light of the world. He said that if you had seen him, you had seen the everlasting Father. He claimed to have the power to forgive sins. And there were some who even claimed that he was God himself. And people began to look back and they looked at this very passage and they said, look, that child looks a lot like this child. And they remembered that Jesus had said that he was a king, though his kingdom was not of this world. Now, of course, there were people who, they didn't accept that. They didn't believe that. They didn't like the fact that there's this nobody from nowhere town, Judah, Palestine, who has no education, no money, no background, and yet people by the droves are following him and believing in him and trusting in him, and he's performing these miracles. They didn't like that. And so they had him brought forth on trumped up charges, had him tried, had him tortured, had him executed. And when he was hanging on the tree and then brought down from the cross and then put into the grave, they congratulated each other and said, there, we took care of him. So much for the so-called king of the Jews. And then God said, look again. And the tomb was empty. Christmas is a beautiful time of year. It can also be a really hard time of year. It's interesting that I think, and you see this even just as you're going about your day, that even in a world that has become so secularized that we don't believe in God or we don't want to identify who this God, the spiritual force is, that we kind of believe vaguely at Christmas something changes. There's a change in the air. There's something that people are searching for. And in a sense, everyone feels the presence of God in a little bit different way, kind of a special way. And in the midst of that, though, there could also be this deep hurt. That God, as you look back on this year, hasn't been who you hoped that he would be. There's hurt that doesn't fade, that you carry with you even into this joyous season that you might quietly, and you don't want anybody to know, but deep down, you still carry some of that wound, some of that hurt for how God has let you down. God hasn't been who you wanted him to be. And to you, God, he says, look again. Look again. Look at Jesus. He is the one who was promised. He is the one who was given to us 2,000 years ago. He is the light who pierces the darkness that threatens to consume us. He is the mighty God who has conquered sin and death itself. He is the everlasting Father who cares for us and loves us beyond anything we can imagine. He is the Prince of Peace who pushes back the fear that creeps so easily within our souls. He is the promise who never fails. If you are at a place in your life where you are tempted to give up on God, look again. Look again. Jesus is the one who came for you. And even now he is here waiting for you to open up your life to him, so that he can be for you all that you need. And can I tell you what's so incredible? Is that when you know Jesus like that, when you have that relationship with him, I can tell you that there's going to come a day where you're going to see him face to face. And you're going to bring your whole history with you. It doesn't disappear. You're going to bring your whole past, your whole history, all of your wounds, all of your scars, all of your disappointments, all of your disillusionments, all the ways that you feel like life has failed you. You're going to carry all of them with you. And in that moment, Jesus is going to look at you and he's going to say, look again. And you will turn and discover that none of it was what you thought it was. And that he has taken the hurts and the wounds and the disappointments, and that he has made them the very material out of which he has created the new you. And you're finally whole. If you're starting to give up on hope today, if you feel like the light within you is close to going out, the darkness is threatening to overwhelm you, or if you're just tired of sleeping through life without any real purpose or meaning, without knowing who you are, look again. Jesus is the King your heart has been searching for all of your life. And if you've never really considered who Jesus is, the claims that he made, to be the very Son of God who came to give his life for the sins of the world, if you've never taken him up on his offer for the forgiveness of sins and the hope of eternal life, maybe you've heard all of this before, but has never really meant much to you. I hope you'll look again. And maybe today is the moment that you choose to allow God to change the trajectory of your life, the trajectory of your future, as you open up your heart to him and let him bring his life into you. If that's you this morning and you've come to a place where you realize that you've come to the end of yourself, you're ready to trust Jesus for what only he can give and what only he can create within you, I just want to pray for you. And so can I just ask everybody to pray with me for a moment? And if you are already a follower of Jesus, would you just pray with me right now for anyone here who has not made that decision? So I can just ask everybody to just bow your heads and close your eyes. If you're already a believer, just pray with me for those who maybe right now are coming to a place to choose this decision that will change their lives and their futures forever. And so if you are ready, you realize that you need Jesus. You are ready to trust him for the forgiveness of sins, for a future that you were made for. That right now, I just want to lead you in a very simple prayer. That you can say, Jesus, I give my life to you. I give my life to you. Father, I just pray for anyone right now listening to my voice, that they would actually hear yours, whispering deep within their soul, within their heart, that they would know your presence and that you would just give them a gentle nudge, Lord, that they would know that you're here and that this is their moment. And maybe they've heard all of this before, but right now to look again at who you are, to look right now again at the life and the hope and the peace and the love that you are offering, to look again right now at the beauty of who you are and the beauty that you want to create within them. Lord, you are the one that we all need. And Lord, if they're ready, I pray that right now that they would whisper to you, heart of hearts, out loud, doesn't matter. They would say to you right now, Jesus, I give you my life. I pray that they would have the courage right now to say to you, Jesus, I give my life to you. And if you've made that decision, Lord, I pray that they would just have the courage to come and share that with us so we can walk this journey along with them, because this is just the beginning. Father, for the rest of us, and really for all of us, Christmas can be such a beautiful time of the year, but also, Lord, there's something about this time as we are faced with just your spirit in the air all around us. We just sense it, your presence. And sometimes that can become uncomfortable because of ways that we want to hold you at arm's length, because of ways that we feel like you've disappointed us, you've let us down. But Lord, you are the everlasting Father who longs to wrap your arms around us. I pray that we would let down our guard, that we would look again at the beauty of who you are and how you've loved us. Lord, that you would draw us close and that we would find our true selves in you. It's a beautiful season. It's a beautiful season because you're a beautiful God. We love you. It's in your name we pray. Amen.